Well, we have some time for questions from the audience. Let's follow our usual tradition of taking questions from students first. And if you don't mind standing up, and if you want to direct your question to a particular speaker, let us know. Yes, please, go ahead.
Mr. Serven, you mentioned how there's demand for World Bank research. And I know that while governments do make use of it, do you think that, say, buy-side firms, whether it's hedge funds, pension funds, and just investment management funds in general, could benefit from the use of World Bank research if they don't make use of it already, in terms of like figuring out certain asset classes and regions of the world that are more stable for investing?
And I'm sure they can draw some benefit, even if they are not clearly the main targets of bank research or fund research, for that matter. That probably would enlighten them more in those respects. But having said that, there is a lot of work, particularly in the financial sector or in the behavior of financial intermediaries or in the prospects of different countries that I'm sure is of interest to private investors as well.
Other questions from students? Now's your chance. Yes.
This is Director Mr. Olivier Blanchard. You stated during your presentation that the IMF used to give consistent advice across programs and countries. I wanted you to further explain this, because doesn't this go against the whole purpose of research? Isn't it research there to determine the different factors that are at play and consider the uniqueness of each situation?
Sorry, can you repeat
because of your voice?
Okay, sorry. I said that during your presentation, you stated that the IMF needs to give consistent advice across programs and countries. And I'm saying that, can you explain this further? Because I would think that it goes against the whole principle of research. Because isn't research there to see the uniqueness of each, to determine the different factors that make every situation unique?
No, you're completely right. I mean, when I said we need we go out with the same set of the right way to put it is we go out with the same set of principles to every country, realizing that each country is completely different. But the general principles of economics apply to all countries. Now, the set of issues which every country has is specific, so we try to tailor it very much to each country. But we try to have some common framework to think about what we do in the various countries. Thank you for clarifying this, yes.
Yes, if there are no more questions from students, any other questions? Okay, if we could go ahead then.
Yes, I wonder if I could ask Olivier and Luis to talk about the evolution of thinking about capital controls in their two organizations, but in particular, the relationship between thinking in the research department and thinking in the country departments. I mean, it follows on the previous question that there is this tension in the case of the fund on capital controls. The research department, I think, has produced findings which suggest that capital controls may well be more beneficial in certain circumstances than the fund used to say very emphatically. So the research department has come out with that sort of finding. But my understanding is that there's quite a range of application of capital control thinking or capital management thinking across country departments. Some country departments are really quite hostile. They don't accept the kind of findings that the research department has come up with. So that there is a tension within the fund on this critical issue of capital controls. Perhaps there is in the World Bank, I'm not quite sure.
You're right. And what happened was the crisis, which made it obvious that many dogmas or positions had to be revisited. So this gave an opening I think the traction came from the research department, there is no question. And the research department fairly quickly concluded that the traditional position had to be revisited and that there were circumstances where capital controls could be used and should be used. Then the next step was indeed to convince the building, if you want to call it this way. And that was not a trivial matter. So actually, if you know the type of products that the fund produces, the research department produced these staff discussion notes, which basically laid our view. Then to get to institutional position, we, as a fund as a whole, wrote board papers. And if you look at the two sets, you see that the board papers are a distributed lag of the staff discussion notes. So that initially, for example, the first step was that the first board paper said that capital controls might be acceptable, but only as a last resort. That to me didn't make any sense from a conceptual point of view. There were cases where I thought it should come first or second, but not necessarily always last. That led to a continuing discussion. We're on the verge of producing a new board paper, which I think will not refer to last resort in any way, and I think has moved away from that. It's a dynamic process in which the idea may start from a research department or somewhere else and then has to actually be accepted by the people who actually go to the countries. I think it's happening. Does it lead to tensions? Yes, it leads to tensions. Are these avoidable? No, I think they are part of the intellectual process. My sense is that we've converged to a position which now I feel, an institutional position, which I feel now is quite reasonable. But it's a fascinating example of the way, if you believe something, you have not only to articulate it, but then sell it. And it takes a while.
If I may add to that, unlike the fund, the bank hasn't produced any prominent papers revisiting its thinking on capital controls, but it is true that across the institution there has been, after the crisis, a thorough reconsideration of the policymakers' toolkit, if you will, to include a number of items under the generic header of macroprudential tools, as part of which capital controls are an issue too. And while I don't think there is a unanimity across the institution, it would be foolish to say to the contrary, it is the case that I think there is increasing consensus in that direction too.
Yes, I think you were next. Go ahead.
My question for Michael. Michael, when you move toward a scaled-up situation, say with a deworming or whatever, are you building a mechanism for revisiting the evidence to see whether the evidence at the micro level holds up when it's scaled to a much larger level of implementation? Because people often talk about it at the small level, it may work, but at the larger level, when a lot of bureaucratic incentives kick in for the way in which money is used, you may not get the same degree of success at a scaled up level. I'm just curious how you handle that issue.
Sure. So if I can talk about the example of conditional cash transfers, it's very, there's been typically been studies in many of the countries, if not all of them, probably not all, but certainly many, to see do the effects seem to generalize. And in fact, they pretty much seem to have generalized. You know, there's some differences around the margins. One of the other things that's happened in the case of conditional cash transfers is there's been efforts to look at variants of the program. So for example, is the conditionality really important? Well, they've examined that, and there's some evidence that it is for some things, not for others. Turns out that you can make the program much more effective by delivering the cash exactly when people need it. For example, when people have to face the next, have to enroll at the next level of school. That can boost enrollment in the next level of school a lot. So I think it is important, as you say, to continue the research process, both to check whether things are working, but also to look for ways to improve things. I think seeing things as a research and then policy is the wrong way. There should be a dialogue between the two. At some point, there becomes a question, what's the most cost-effective use of resources? We probably don't need the 31st study of what's the basic impact of conditional cash transfers in the 31st country. Or at least that might not be as big a priority as something else.
I think we have time for one more brief question, and then we'll continue the dialogue over lunch. Yes, go ahead in the front.
I have a question for Blanchard. And it's a small country's perspective on research in policy institutions. I come from the central bank of Norway. And we've benefited tremendously from the interaction with the research community and also the fund from engaging in the development of tools which are of value for policy. And then, of course, in the implementation of ideas, you have the intellectual debate and you need to, as you said, be the intellectual irritant, or as we have phrased it, provide the organization with some night vision, where we really do not know, where there's a lot of unknowns there. But there are some challenges. One is the relevance and to sort of facilitate the interaction between researchers who are evaluating on academic merits and practitioners in policy departments. But there is another dimension, and that is when you take research to the decision-making level. So I would like to hear some comments on how you think about integrating research into decision.
The question is indeed the relevant one. I think two parts. The first one is, I have two jobs officially. One is Director of Research and the other is Economic Counselor. And at this stage, I would say that each one takes about half of my working time. And as the Economic Counselor, I'm in a position in which I can sell whatever it is that I've learned from the other half of the job in the context of discussions about current issues. That might be actually something that, I think that's something which is unique to the fund, and that might be something that could be considered elsewhere, which to involve a Director of Research very directly into the decision-making process. The other is, as I've said, that this helps me communicate with management and be part of the decisions we take. There is the more mundane but even more important task of having an effect on Article 4s, on missions, on programs, which may not be taken by management but may be taken by the desk themselves. And there again, I've seen part of what I had to do is making sure that I sell to the ultimate customers. This implies discussion with specific countries, specific desks, and that's the other part of selling. I think you sell up and you sell, I would say down, but sell to the side. That's very important indeed.
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of very brief announcements. The first is that we have an informal lunch ready next door at the faculty club, same place we were last night for the dinner. This is for speakers and other invited guests. The second announcement is that for CDE fellows, you have a lunch ready for you at the CDE. And then finally, the third announcement is that we will start again at 1:45 here. Okay, thanks very much.
Very good.